You are never the heir. You are merely a servant bearing the family name. Gwendolyn scoffed, tossing the 5-day handover calendar onto my mahogany desk. Nerina is the daughter I truly want for this empire. Train her, hand over the keys, and disappear. Your time here is up. If you're lucky, I won't sue you for the hours you've wasted in this building. I didn't yell. I only felt the last thread of loyalty snap as I turned toward the hallway and pulled back the heavy curtain. The air inside the Avery Gwen Plaza Hotel ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne, yet it was colder than a Houston winter. I stood beneath the shadow of velvet wings, gazing at the sea of people in silk dresses and tailored suits. These were the people I had served for a decade. The elite, the powerful, the friends of the Avery name. But as I watched them sip their drinks, I realized the expensive perfume in this room couldn't mask the smell of cheap loyalty. 10 years of my life had been poured into these foundations, stone by stone, while I remained the silent architect of my father's empire. He always told me, true power isn't heard by shouting, but felt by results. I lived by those words. I produced results. Yet, in this brightly lit room, I had never felt so invisible. Gwendolyn stood on the stage, the crystal chandeliers reflecting in her eyes like ice. She commanded the room with a practiced grace, her voice a velvet blade that sliced through the chatter. My mother spoke of growth, of legacy, and of bold new directions, all while purposefully keeping her gaze an inch above my head. It is a strange thing to be erased while you are still standing in the room. I looked at the crowd, seeing the nodding heads of men who once called my father a brother. We often mistake a loud presence for leadership, forgetting that the roots of a tree are what keep it standing in a Texas storm. I was the roots. She was the decorative bark, and she was currently announcing that the tree no longer needed its foundation. Aimee, please, join us on stage, Gwendolyn said, her voice echoing with a warmth that didn't reach her hands. I stepped into the light, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The applause was polite, hesitant. I saw Nerina standing there, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. She was younger, polished, and carried an air of entitlement that only someone who hadn't earned their place could possess. My mother didn't call me up to honor me. She didn't mention the double-digit growth I'd secured or the contracts I'd saved. Instead, she turned to the board and the donors, her hand resting on Nerina's shoulder. Succession requires a predatory instinct, Gwendolyn declared, her eyes finally meeting mine with a chilling finality. Aimee has served us well, but her time is over. Nerina is the future of the Avery legacy. The room went silent, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my lungs. Then came the demand that felt like a physical blow to my chest. To honor our traditions, Gwendolyn continued, her voice dropping to a low, ceremonial tone. Aimee will now hand over the ancestral signet ring, the symbol of the CEO's authority. She looked at me, her expression a mix of triumph and disdain. Kneel, Aimee. Show our new leader the respect she has earned. The humiliation was a ritual, a public execution of my dignity. I felt the heat rise in my neck, the urge to turn and run nearly overwhelming. But I remembered my father. I remembered the way he carried himself even when the world was trying to break him. I didn't kneel because I was weak. I didn't kneel because she broke me. I moved slowly, my dress rustling against the stage, and lowered myself to one knee as a final act of grace toward the man who truly built this place. As I held out the heavy gold ring, I leaned in, my voice a mere whisper that only the two women could hear. A crown can be handed over, but the head that wears it must be earned. Nerina's smirk flickered for a second, a shadow of doubt crossing her face as she reached for the gold. As her fingers brushed mine, I met her eyes with a terrifyingly calm gaze. She flinched, the ring nearly slipping from her grasp. She saw it then, the fire behind the silence. Gwendolyn might have had the stage, and Nerina might have had the ring, but they didn't have my soul. I stood up, the movement fluid and deliberate. I didn't wait for permission to leave. I simply turned and walked through the crowd. I didn't run. I didn't cry. Dignity is the only thing they cannot take unless you give it to them, and I was keeping mine firmly tucked away in my pocket. The ballroom doors closed behind me, muffled laughter and music fading into a dull hum. I walked down the long, marbled hallway toward the exit. In the dim light near the elevators, Alistair was waiting. He didn't offer pity. He knew better than that. He simply handed me a secure tablet, its screen glowing with a series of complex codes. "The physical ring is hers," he said softly, his eyes reflecting the sharp intelligence I had trusted for years. "But the blood oath digital protocols your father set up? They don't recognize her fingerprints. They only recognize yours." I paused, the weight of the tablet a comforting anchor in my hand. "They think they've taken my seat at the table," I whispered, looking back at the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. "They don't realize I've already moved the table to a different room." As I approached the glass doors of the lobby, I saw Thomas, an elderly server who had been with the company since the day I was born. He was sitting on a bench, his head in his hands, his uniform jacket folded neatly beside him. Gwendolyn had fired him earlier that night for a spilled drink. A man who had given 30 years of his life for a single mistake. I stopped, kneeling beside him, and slipped my personal card into his pocket. "Loyalty isn't a transaction, Thomas. It's a sanctuary," I said, my voice thick with a kindness I hadn't shown myself all night. "Call this number tomorrow. You still have a job. It just won't be here." He looked at me with teary eyes, but I walked toward the parking attendant. The Houston night air was damp, faintly smelling of rain and asphalt. I watched the attendant bring my car over, the headlights piercing the darkness. The tower behind looked majestic, glittering with thousands of lights, but I didn't feel it was tall. It felt fragile, like a deck of playing cards waiting for the wind to change direction. And as I left the curb, I knew the wind had begun to howl. The morning light streamed through the windows of the Avery Gwen Plaza building with surprising precision, and after a decade, I felt like an intruder in my own home. I pulled my coat tighter against the chill of the lobby, my heavy footsteps echoing on the marble floor. As I ascended to the executive floor, the usual rhythm of work became tense, like a radio frequency losing its signal. I pushed open the double oak doors to my office, expecting to see my familiar mahogany desk and the orderly chaos of marketing campaigns. Instead, I found two IT technicians standing beside my computer, their hands moving so fast I felt like they were performing an autopsy. My hardware had been packed up. My security servers had been disconnected. Gwendolyn stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette sharp against the Houston skyline. She didn't turn around when I entered. "Your credentials have been revoked, Aimee," she said, her voice as flat as a dial tone. "We're clearing out the dead weight to make room for Nerina's new infrastructure. Everything you've touched is being scrubbed." I walked toward my desk, or what used to be my desk, and tried to log into the central database one last time. "Access denied." The words flashed in a mocking crimson. 10 years of project files, the client testimonials I had painstakingly gathered, and the digital archive of my father's private mentorship. Everything was gone. It wasn't just a restructuring, it was a digital execution. I haven't been forgotten. I've been erased. In that moment, the weight of the betrayal settled in my stomach like lead. Every late night I spent here, every weekend I sacrificed to fix the errors my mother ignored. All of it was being treated like a glitch in the system. I reached for a small cardboard box, the only thing they had left me. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. My father once told me that true competence doesn't need to shout to be recognized. It simply exists while others struggle to catch up. They can delete the data, but they can't delete the intelligence that created it. Silence is sometimes the loudest way to say, "Watch me." I began packing the few non-digital items I had left. A fountain pen from my father, a paperweight from my first successful contract. I looked at the blank monitor where my legacy used to live. Have you ever stood in the middle of your life's work and realized you were truly alone? I wondered if I should have fought harder, but the clarity of the moment told me otherwise. Would you have stayed silent or played along to survive? I chose to play, but I was no longer following their script. I tucked the small box under my arm and walked out without a word, leaving the ghost of my career behind. The mandatory training session for Nerina was held in the glass-walled conference room at noon. I sat at the end of the long table, a stranger at my own funeral. Nerina was leading the meeting, her voice shrill with a forced authority that made the veteran staff flinch. She was presenting a new strategy that was essentially a butchered version of a plan I had written 3 years ago. She looked over at me, a smug grin tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Aimee, honey, be a dear and grab some more coffee," she said, before deliberately tipping her cup over my handwritten notes, the ones with my father's scribbled advice in the margins. "Oh, oops. I guess you're just a glorified babysitter now anyway. You've only got 4 days of relevance left." The dark liquid seeped into the paper, blurring the ink of the only man who ever truly believed in me. I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't even blink. I simply looked at the screen where she was displaying a massive financial projection error, a mistake that would cost the company millions in tax penalties. "Line 42, I said, my voice cutting through her laughter like a razor. "You've miscalculated the depreciation on the Houston assets. Your entire Q3 forecast is off by 12%, but please, continue. I'm sure your intuition is better than the math." The room went silent. Nerina fumbled with the remote, her face flushing a deep, ugly red. She knew I was right. Everyone in the room knew I was right. I noticed a young intern in the corner, her hands trembling as Nerina began to snap at her to cover her own embarrassment. It's a tragedy how some people think leadership is about making others feel small. As the meeting broke for lunch, I pulled the girl aside in the hallway. I placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Never let someone else's insecurity define your worth, Sarah. Your talent is your own, no matter who signs the paycheck at the end of the month." She looked at me with a mix of fear and gratitude, and I realized that while Gwendolyn owned the building, she would never own the people. Blood makes us related, but loyalty makes us family. Today I realized I am an only child in a room full of strangers. That evening, the rain began to drum against the windows of a secluded cafe in downtown Houston. The lighting was dim, the air smelling of roasted beans and damp coats. Alistair was already sitting in a corner booth, 2 folders laid out before him. He didn't say hello. We were past the point of pleasantries. "They think the erasure worked," he said, sliding a secure drive across the table. Gwendolyn gave the order to wipe the servers at midnight. "What she doesn't know is that your father mirrored the most sensitive legal files to a private server in Switzerland years ago. He knew this day would come, Aimee." I ran my thumb over the cold metal of the drive. "What does it show, Alistair?" I asked. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "It shows a fiduciary trap. Under Texas corporate law, a CEO is legally bound to disclose all assets and liabilities during a leadership transition. By scrubbing your contributions and hiding the debt your father assigned to you, Gwendolyn is committing a felony. She isn't just firing you. She's trying to hide a massive financial disaster she created while you were out building the empire." The pieces began to fit together. My mother wasn't just being cruel. She was being desperate. She needed me gone so no one would look at the books. I looked Alistair in the eye. "Initiate the shadow audit. I want to see every crack in her personal accounts. I want to know where the money went." I knew then that I wasn't just fighting for a job. I was fighting for the truth of what had happened to my father's company. I was no longer the daughter waiting for a seat at the table. I was the one building a new house. My phone buzzed on the table, a high-priority alert flashing across the screen. My heart skipped a beat. It was a notification from the encrypted security system in my father's private vault at the estate, the one Gwendolyn had been trying to crack for months. "Unauthorized access attempt detected," the message read. I leaned back into the shadows of the booth, a thin, cold smile touching my lips. Alistair looked at me, questioning. I didn't need to say it. The bait has been taken. Gwendolyn thought she was hunting me, but she had just stepped into the first layer of my father's design. This was where it all started to unravel. The rain against the windshield of Alistair's parked sedan was relentless, a rhythmic drumming that felt like a countdown. We sat on a dimly lit street in River Oaks, the neighborhood where I grew up, but tonight the towering oaks and iron gates looked like the bars of a cage. Alistair didn't say a word as he handed me a heavy manila envelope. I pulled out a DNA profile and a series of birth records from a private clinic in the Cayman Islands. My breath hitched. Nerina wasn't just a strategic hire or a protege Gwendolyn had found at a rival firm. She was Gwendolyn's biological daughter, the result of a secret affair with Julian Vane. The name Julian Vane felt like a poison in my mouth. He was the man who spent 30 years trying to dismantle my father's legacy, the enemy who had nearly bankrupted us a dozen times. My entire life had been a carefully constructed facade. Gwendolyn hadn't just been cold or demanding, she had been a Trojan horse, actively grooming her secret child to inherit the very empire my father had died trying to protect. She was effectively killing his lineage from the inside out, replacing his blood with the blood of the man he loathed most. Betrayal is never a sudden act. It's a slow-growing vine that eventually chokes the life out of everything you thought was true. I stared at the wipers swiping away the deluge, my reflection in the window looking pale but remarkably steady. In Texas, Alistair, they say you don't truly know a person until you see how they handle a drought, I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the storm. My mother has been parched for a long time. She's been thirsty for a life she thought she missed out on, and she's willing to burn the world down to get a taste of it. I felt a strange sense of clarity. The pain was there, deep and jagged, but the confusion was gone. I knew exactly who I was fighting now. I drove back to the estate, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway of a house that no longer felt like home. Gwendolyn and Nerina were waiting for me in the mahogany-paneled library, a fire crackling in the hearth that did nothing to warm the room. Gwendolyn didn't look up from her desk. She simply slid a thick legal binder toward me. It was a marriage contract to Silas Thorne, a man twice my age, notorious in the Houston social scene for his erratic temper and a string of broken, silent women. He also happened to possess the massive capital Gwendolyn needed to bail out Nerina's disastrous tech investments. "Since you failed to be a leader, Aimee, you will be an asset," Gwendolyn said, her tone as cold as a marble headstone. "This marriage secures Nerina's position and salvages what's left of your reputation. Sign it or you leave this house tonight with nothing but the clothes on your back." I looked at the signatures already on the page, Silas's bold, arrogant scrawl and my mother's elegant script. She had sold me. Not for survival, but for the vanity of her secret daughter. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at the contract, then at the woman who had given birth to me, but never given me a heart. "You can value a company, Gwendolyn, and you certainly have, and you valued me," I said, standing tall. "But you can't value a soul that has decided it belongs to itself. I won't sign your contract, and I won't leave empty-handed." I turned and walked toward the door, leaving the file on the table. The silence behind me weighed heavily on Gwendolyn's rising anger, which after 30 years, no longer frightened me. I sought refuge in the kitchen, the one place in the house where the air felt human. I found Maria, our elderly housekeeper, sitting at the small wooden table with her head in her hands. She had been with us since before I was born, a woman who knew the secrets of every room. She was crying because Gwendolyn had refused to pay for her daughter's emergency heart surgery, calling it a personal matter that wasn't the company's responsibility. I sat beside her, taking her weathered hand in mine. Without a word, I used my phone to transfer the full amount from my personal savings to her daughter's hospital account. "Kindness is a debt that never expires, Maria," I whispered as she looked at the confirmation screen in disbelief. "My father taught me that a home isn't made of bricks. It's made of the people who care for one another." She held my hand tightly, her eyes filled with a prayer I didn't need to hear to understand. It was a stark reminder of the truth often forgotten in the pursuit of power. Character is what you do in the dark when no one is looking. My mother was standing in the spotlight of the Houston elite, but her character had long since vanished into the shadows. As I walked back down the wide hallway, the pendulum clock chimed midnight. It was the clock my father still wound every Sunday afternoon, a ritual he believed kept the house's spirit beating. I paused before it, watching the pendulum swing steadily. The secret I was searching for wasn't in the filing cabinet or hidden in overseas accounts. It was right here, in the objects my father had touched. The things Gwendolyn considered mere ornaments. I reached out and ran my hand over the polished wood, feeling a hollow space beneath a decorative carving. The rain against the window sounded like a countdown, each drop a second closer to a truth that would shatter the Avery name forever. Gwendolyn thought she had stripped me of my position, my dignity, and my future. But as the clock chimed the final stroke of midnight, I realized my father hadn't left me a fortune. He had left me a weapon. I stood there in the dark, the weight of the house pressing down on me, and I whispered into the silence. "It's time to talk back, Dad. I'm ready to listen." The midnight air in the grand foyer was still, yet the silence felt heavy with the weight of decades. I stood alone before the towering grandfather clock, its dark mahogany frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the moonlight streaming through the stained glass. For years, I had watched my father's hands perform the Sunday ritual of winding this clock, his movements precise and reverent. At the time, I thought he was simply preserving a piece of history. Now I understood he was maintaining a heartbeat. The skeletal shadows of the oak trees outside stretched across the marble floor, pointing toward the pendulum's steady swing. The house felt cold, but it was a different chill than the one Gwendolyn projected. It was the chill of a tomb that had been desecrated. My father didn't just teach me how to read a balance sheet or negotiate a contract. He taught me that a man's character is his fate. Looking at the vacant space where his portrait used to hang, I understood that Gwendolyn's fate had been sealed the moment she chose the shadow of greed over the light of the man who truly loved her. Character is what remains when the wealth is gone, and she was already spiritually bankrupt. I reached out, my fingers tracing the decorative floral carving near the base of the clock's face. My heart hammered against my ribs as my thumb found the slight indentation my father had whispered about in those final, hazy hours at the hospital. He was a pioneer in cybersecurity, a man who built firewalls before the world knew they needed them. My pulse quickened as I pressed down. I didn't want vengeance. I wanted restoration. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and whispered a promise into the dark. "I will not let them turn your sanctuary into a marketplace, Dad. I am bringing the light back." A faint metallic click echoed through the silent foyer. The internal mechanism shifted, a sound like a heavy bolt being drawn back. A small, velvet-lined compartment slid open near the pendulum, revealing a vintage wristwatch, the one my father wore every single day. I picked it up, the leather worn and smelling faintly of his cedarwood cologne. As I strapped it to my wrist, the small glass face flickered to life. A biometric sensor scanned my pulse, recognizing the Avery rhythm that Gwendolyn had tried so hard to suppress. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a dead man's switch, a sophisticated smart contract trust recognized under Texas estate law. Suddenly, a soft, digitized hum filled the air. A holographic interface projected from the watch, and my father's voice, warm and steady as a summer evening in Houston, filled the room. "Aimee," the recording began. "If you are hearing this, then the wind has changed, just as I feared it would." He explained that he had watched Gwendolyn's heart harden over the years, seeing her drift toward the very enemies he fought to keep at bay. He had entrusted me, and only me, with the Ghost Ledger, a secret holding company that had quietly acquired the majority of the firm's outstanding corporate debt over the last 5 years. I tapped my earpiece, connecting to Alistair's secure line. "He did it, Alistair. The watch is the key." My lawyer's voice came through, sharp with professional admiration. "Aimee, that digital key bypasses every corporate firewall Gwendolyn and Nerina have installed. You aren't just an employee anymore. You hold the nuclear option. You can freeze the company's liquidity and trigger a debt call in seconds." The power of the revelation made my hands shake, but I forced them still. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. I was no longer afraid of the shadows because I was finally the one holding the torch. The first pale streaks of dawn began to bleed across the Houston skyline, turning the glass of the high-rises from black to a bruised purple. I walked to the window of my bedroom, looking at my reflection in the glass. The youngest daughter, who spent her life seeking a nod of approval from a mother who couldn't give it, was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that leadership isn't a title granted by a board. It's a responsibility inherited by the brave. What would you do if you realized the person you feared was actually standing on a foundation you owned? Sometimes the only thing between you and freedom is a single decision to stand up. I spent the next hour in the quiet stillness, preparing my attire for the day. I chose a suit of midnight blue, the color my father wore to every major closing, while Gwendolyn and Nerina were likely in the sunroom plotting my public execution. For later that morning, I was already drafting their eviction notices. But even as I prepared for battle, I remembered the humanity my father championed. I sat at my desk and wrote a final letter to the foundations supporting local STEM schools, the one my mother planned to defund. I doubled their endowment for my personal trust. True wealth is not measured by what you keep, but by what you protect. A sudden, sharp banging on my bedroom door shattered the morning silence. It wasn't the polite knock of a maid. It was the aggressive, heavy-handed thud of Gwendolyn's private security team. They were early. My mother wanted me out before the board could even gather. I took a deep breath, adjusted my collar, and checked the watch. The ghost ledger was active. The digital sword was unsheathed. "Aimee, open this door immediately!" A voice barked from the hallway. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I walked toward the door with a measured, rhythmic pace that felt like destiny. I reached for the handle, a cold, calculated calm settling over me. "Let them in," I whispered to the empty room. "The game is finally fair." I adjusted my cuffs, looking at the door as the handle turned, knowing that the trap they set for me was about to become their own cage. The handle turned with a slow, deliberate creak that echoed in the marrow of my bones. Gwendolyn didn't enter alone. She was flanked by two men whose suits couldn't hide the jagged edges of their past. Former mercenaries now playing the part of high-end corporate security. "Aimee, you've made this much harder than it needed to be," Gwendolyn whispered, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. I didn't have time to respond. In a blur of calculated motion, she lunged toward the marble pedestal in the center of my study, deliberately striking her forehead against the sharp edge. The sound of the impact was sickening. She collapsed to the floor, blood blooming across her pale skin like a macabre flower. Nerina burst into the room a second later, a smartphone already aimed and recording from an angle that made it appear as though I had shoved my mother in a fit of rage. "Help! She's trying to kill her!" Nerina shrieked, her voice carrying down the hallways to ensure every servant heard the lie. Before I could draw breath to protest, the cold, heavy bite of steel snapped around my wrists. The mercenaries didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They acted with the cold efficiency of a machine. I felt the metallic tang of fear in my mouth, but beneath it, a searing, white-hot clarity began to take hold. When a mother uses her own blood as a weapon against her child, she hasn't just lost her way. She has lost her soul. Gwendolyn looked up from the floor, the victim mask slipping for just a fraction of a second to reveal a predatory glint of triumph. "Citizen's arrest for attempted murder," the lead guard grunted, hauling me toward the service stairs. I didn't struggle. I didn't scream. A cornered Avery is a dangerous thing, and they had just backed me into the deepest corner they could find. They threw me into the soundproof wine cellar in the basement, the heavy iron-bolted door slamming shut with a finality that felt like a tombstone being laid. The air was damp, smelling of ancient oak and expensive dust. I sat on the cold floor, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't panic. Instead, I closed my eyes and began the rhythmic breathing my father had taught me during the long Texas summers. "Control the breath, Aimee, and you control the room," he used to say. I lowered my heart rate until the pulsing in my ears faded to a dull hum. I wasn't just a prisoner. I was an observer. I waited until the footsteps above faded. The basement signal jammers were hummed in the background, a high-frequency buzz designed to prevent exactly what I was about to do. I tapped the face of my father's vintage watch twice. The satellite transmitter, a piece of military-grade tech hidden within the mechanical gears, bypassed the house's localized jamming effortlessly. A small green light flickered on the dial, Alistair was online. Aimee? Are you okay? The biometric feed shows your stress levels spiked. His voice crackled in my earpiece, thin but steady. Initiate the sandcastle protocol, Alistair. I whispered into the dark, my voice devoid of emotion. Gwendolyn has moved from corporate sabotage to criminal theater. If they want to play God with my freedom, I will play Reaper with their finances. I heard the frantic clicking of a keyboard on the other end. The sandcastle protocol was my father's ultimate failsafe. A systematic, automated withdrawal of liquidity from every Avery Gwen account across the globe. It was a digital, scorched earth policy. Within the hour, the empire Gwendolyn was so desperate to protect would be nothing more than a hollow shell of empty accounts and frozen assets. The cellar door creaked open an hour later. It wasn't Gwendolyn. Elias, an older guard who had served my father for 20 years, stepped inside holding a cup of water. His hands were steady, but his eyes were filled with a shame he couldn't hide. He looked at the handcuffs, then at me. "I'm sorry, Miss Aimee." "Orders are orders," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I took the water and looked at him with a quiet, devastating compassion. "You're just following orders, Elias. I don't blame you for needing to survive. But remember, the person who pays the most isn't always the person who leads the best. My father knew your name. Does Gwendolyn even know your face?" He didn't answer, but his shoulders slumped as he turned to leave. I watched the door close and realized that night that forgiveness is a gift for the repentant, but justice is a right for the innocent. Would you have forgiven someone who ruined your peace just because they share your blood? I thought of Gwendolyn's blood on the floor upstairs, a sacrifice she made to a god of greed. I was standing in the dark, stripped of my title and my freedom, but I had never seen my path more clearly. The ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of comfort, but where they stand at times of challenge. The door opened again, but this time the footsteps were sharp, impatient. Gwendolyn stepped into the cellar, a bandage on her forehead and a stack of legal documents in her hand. The victim was gone. She was now the executioner. "Sign these, Aimee," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small space. "A full confession of assault and a permanent resignation of all trust interests. Sign them, or the police will find a murder weapon in your room with your prints on it." I've already had Nerina place the knife. I looked up at her, the dim light catching the edge of my father's watch. I didn't feel terror. I felt a cold, crystalline pity. "You've spent so much time trying to bury me, Gwendolyn, that you forgot to check the ground you're standing on," I said softly. I looked at the pen in her hand, then at the time on my wrist. In exactly 4 hours, the Avery Gwen name would be worth less than the paper she was holding. The sandcastle was already collapsing. I looked her in the eye and smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that caused her to take a step back. I didn't need to sign anything. The game was already over. She just hadn't heard the whistle yet. The boardroom doors of Avery Gwen Plaza felt like the entrance to a courtroom, and as I stepped inside, I knew that I was no longer the defendant, but the judge. It was exactly 9:01 a.m. I didn't rush. I walked with a quiet thunder that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. Alistair walked to my right, his briefcase looking like a weapon of war, while 2 stone-faced federal observers followed behind us. I had chosen my attire with intent, a tailored suit in my father's favorite shade of midnight blue. It was the color of a storm at sea, deep, calm, and absolute. Gwendolyn sat at the head of the long mahogany table, nursing a cup of tea with a smugness that bordered on the divine. She didn't even look up when I pulled out my chair. In her mind, the game was already over. She believed the grainy, manipulated footage of her assault in the basement had destroyed my credibility forever. Nerina sat beside her, already preening like a queen-elect, her eyes scanning the room for the admiration she thought she was about to receive. A house built on lies doesn't need a storm to knock it down. It only needs the truth to stop supporting the weight. I felt the red marks from the handcuffs on my wrists. Scars are just the maps of where we've been, not the definition of where we are going. The room was filled with the board of directors, men who had known my father for 40 years. They avoided my gaze, their eyes fixed on their digital tablets or the steam rising from their coffee. The silence was thick, a heavy, suffocating blanket of complicity. Gwendolyn cleared her throat, the sound sharp as a gavel. As Aimee has demonstrated a clear lack of emotional stability and, quite frankly, a capacity for violence, she began, her voice dripping with artificial sorrow. The chair moves for a vote to permanently strip her of all inheritance, voting rights, and association with the Avery name, effective immediately. One by one, the anchors of hope I had relied on began to lift. Arthur, the oldest member and my father's best friend, raised his hand without looking at me. Then Miller, then Henderson. These were the men Gwendolyn had bought with false promises and the currency of fear. I felt the sting of the betrayal, a sharp, cold blade in the ribs. Fear is the currency of cowards, and today this room was bankrupt. I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I looked Arthur directly in his watery eyes and spoke softly, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. I don't hate you for your fear, Arthur. I only pity you for forgetting the man who gave you this seat. He would have stood for you. He flinched, his hand trembling as he lowered it, but the damage was done. The vote was unanimous. Nerina stood up, her face glowing with a predatory joy. Thank you, Mother, and thank you, Board. As the new CEO, I promise to— Sit down, Nerina, Alistair interrupted, his voice cutting through her speech with the cold authority of a high court judge. He didn't look at her. He stood up and placed a single crimson-sealed folder in the center of the mahogany table. The room went dead silent. Gwendolyn's smug expression faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes. This meeting is out of order, Alistair continued. You cannot strip rights from a person who no longer holds them by inheritance, but by acquisition. Gwendolyn scoffed, her teacup clinking against the saucer. What on earth are you talking about? She has nothing. Alistair didn't blink. Actually, Gwendolyn, you over-leveraged this company's primary assets to fund Nerina's failing tech ventures in Asia. You turned the Avery legacy into a stack of high-interest debt. What you didn't know is that the primary creditor of that debt is a fund known as MKS Ventures, the ghost ledger established by Aimee's father. He opened the folder, revealing the digital signatures and the debt-to-equity swap execution. As of 8 a.m. this morning, MKS Ventures has called in the debt. In exchange for the unpaid billions, the fund has executed its right to take 51% of the voting shares. Aimee is the sole trustee of that fund. The air left Gwendolyn's lungs in a visible gasp. She looked like a woman watching her house burn down from the inside. I stood up slowly and walked toward the head of the table. Gwendolyn stayed frozen in the CEO chair, her hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles went white. I didn't push her. I didn't need to. I simply waited for the reality to sink in. In Texas law, Gwendolyn, the owner of the debt is the owner of the house, I said, my voice as steady as the pendulum of my father's clock. And right now, you are very, very deep in debt. Success isn't about owning the most. It's about being the person others can't afford to lose. My father understood that. He had built a failsafe that only recognized my pulse, my character, and my willingness to stand up when the world went dark. Finally, I had chosen myself. And that's not selfish. It's survival. Have you ever watched a bully realize they have no power left? It's the quietest sound in the world. The room was so silent I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I saw Gwendolyn's reflection in the polished wood of the table, a woman who had sold her daughter for a title she no longer owned. I sat in the CEO chair for the first time, the leather cool and firm beneath me. It wasn't a prize, it was a responsibility. I reached into my folder and pulled out a small handheld mirror, sliding it across the table until it stopped right in front of my mother. Look at yourself, Gwendolyn, I said, my tone devoid of malice, filled only with a cold, crystalline truth. Look at the woman who sacrificed everything for a chair that now belongs to the daughter she tried to erase. Gwendolyn's face contorted, her mouth opening to scream, but no sound came out. She was a ghost in her own empire. I felt the leather of the chair beneath me, not as a prize, but as a responsibility, knowing that the hardest part of the journey was finally behind me. The silence of the executive suite was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet promise of a future where integrity was the only currency that mattered. I looked at Gwendolyn, whose face was still a mask of silent shock, and then at Alistair. He nodded. The professional bond between us forged in the fires of the last 5 days. It was time to finish this. I reached into my folder and pulled out the foreclosure papers, notarized and stamped by the state of Texas earlier that morning. I slid them across the mahogany surface. The house in River Oaks, Gwendolyn. The one you used as collateral for your secret loans to cover Nerina's failures. It's gone. I watched her eyes scan the document, the realization sinking in that she had gambled away the very roof over her head. The estate now belongs to the Avery Foundation, a foundation I now control. You aren't just losing a company today, you're losing a residence. Nerina began to shriek about her rights, her voice a sharp discord in the room. You can't do this. I have an employment contract. I'm the CEO. I looked at her, my expression unwavering. Actually, Nerina, I reviewed your file. Gwendolyn was so eager to announce you that she never had you sign the final binding agreement. Under the at-will employment clause of the unsigned draft, you are never legally an employee. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. I signaled to the security team, men who actually respected the Avery name. Escort her from the building. Now. Gwendolyn finally found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. Aimee, please. We are blood. You can't leave your mother with nothing. I looked at her with a quiet, devastating compassion. I didn't feel the urge to scream or strike back. Mercy is sparing you the consequences of your actions, Gwendolyn, but justice is allowing you to learn from them. You chose Julian Vane's blood over my father's legacy. This is simply the harvest of the seeds you sowed. I turned to the board of directors, who sat in stunned silence. Effective immediately, we are reinstating the pension funds and healthcare benefits for every employee Gwendolyn cut in the last quarter, I stated, my voice echoing with an authority that didn't need to be raised. A true leader eats last and ensures the village is fed first. We start by fixing the lives you broke. Arthur and the others nodded, their shame replaced by a flicker of hope. They saw my father in me, and for the first time in years, the room felt balanced. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the Houston skyline. Below, on the plaza level, I could see workers on scaffolding. They were already beginning to remove the Gwen from the Avery Gwen Plaza signage. This was the final erasure, but it wasn't born of malice. It was a legal necessity. Gwendolyn was no longer a partner, a CEO, or even a public figure associated with this firm. She had been removed from every corporate record. I turned back to my mother, offering her a choice that was more than she had ever offered me. You can face the fraud charges for the deepfakes and the tax evasion Alistair uncovered, or you can live in the guest wing of the estate. You will work as a consultant for the foundation, earning a modest salary to pay off the debts you owe the trust. You taught me that my time was over. I am teaching you that your time was never about the title. It was about the people you stepped on to get it. Now you get to see them from the other side. She looked defeated, the fire of her ego finally extinguished. She was no longer a titan. She was just an elderly woman facing a humbled reality. She didn't win because she thought power was a weapon. I didn't win out of revenge. I won by choosing peace. Have you ever realized that the best way to deal with a narcissist is to simply stop being their mirror? I finally stopped reflecting her darkness, and without my light to feed on, she had nothing left but her own shadow. I stepped out onto the balcony, the warm Houston air greeting me. Alistair joined me, looking out at the city we had just reclaimed. Thank you, Alistair, I said, not just for the law, but for the loyalty. I handed him a new appointment letter. I'm making you the chairman of the ethics committee. A man like you is the heartbeat of a company that actually matters. We need someone who remembers that the law has a soul. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I visited my father's favorite spot in the garden at the estate. I took the ancestral signet ring from my pocket, the one Gwendolyn had made me hand over on my knees. I placed it on the small stone plinth he had loved so much. I didn't just save your company, Dad, I whispered into the orange glow of the sunset. I saved your soul within it. The foundation is solid again. I stood there for a long time, feeling a profound sense of liberation. 3 days ago, I didn't leave this house out of weakness. I left to return as the person I've always aspired to be, Success isn't about making money. It's about building something that will last after you're gone. I looked back at the house, then gazed into the distance where the city lights began to twinkle. I wasn't searching for a path. I was standing on that very path. I watched the Houston sun dip below the horizon, the orange glow reflecting off the glass of a tower that finally, truly, felt like home. Have you ever rebuilt from nothing? If you have, you know that the view from the top is only beautiful because of the climb. It's the scars on our hands that make the victory worth holding. I sat on the garden bench, finally at peace with the ghosts of the past. Tell me your story. I'm listening. Because sometimes the only way to find your voice is to let the silence speak for itself.